There are trains that take you somewhere, and then there are trains that take you away from something. Harlan Voss knew the difference. He'd always known. 30 years on the Metropolitan Police. 30 years of learning to read what people left behind, the silences between words, the spaces between lies. And now he was retired, officially done. But men like Harlan Voss don't stop seeing things. They simply stop being paid for it. The train had no business looking the way it did. Vintage brass fittings, gas lamps burning in the corridors, too still, too perfect, as though they'd forgotten what flames were supposed to do. The carriages gleamed like a memory that refused to fade. He told himself it was just the late hour, just the cold, just the particular melancholy that grips a man who no longer has a case to chase. He picked up his bag and stepped aboard. The fog came the moment the wheels began to turn. Not the ordinary murk of a city night, not that orange-tinted haze that softens the street lamps and blurs the storefronts. This fog was white, dense, deliberate. It pressed against the glass the way a hand presses against a wound, like it was trying to get in. Harlan stood in the observation car and watched London disappear. Not gradually, instantly, as though the city had decided not to be seen tonight. He noticed the businessman immediately, a man in his 50s, the kind of face you'd pass in a corridor and never remember seeing. But his hands gave him away. He kept checking his watch, not to tell the time, but to count something, to measure something running out. Hell of a fog tonight. Isn't it? The porter says it's normal for the northern route, something to do with the valley channels. He introduced himself as Gerald Fenn, import and export. He said it the way men say things they've rehearsed, practiced vagueness. Harlan had sat across from 1,000 men like him in interview rooms. He recognized the performance. He just didn't yet know who the audience was. They talked for 20 minutes. Gerald Fenn checked his watch 11 times. Harlan counted. He was gone 90 seconds. 90 seconds. When he returned, the corner was empty, the briefcase gone, the seat warm but vacant, as though Gerald Fenn had been nothing more than a thought the room had briefly entertained, then reconsidered. Harlan asked the porter, Ellis, a good-natured man running on his 4th consecutive night shift, if he'd seen where the businessman had gone. Ellis frowned. He tried hard. He genuinely tried. There was someone, wasn't there? Can't quite... I'm sorry, sir. Long shift. Things get muddled. Things get muddled. That was one way to put it. Harlan returned to his berth and found another explanation waiting for him on his pillow, folded once, written in ink the color of old rust. The mist remembers what you forget. He sat on the edge of the bed and held that note for a long time. Outside, the white fog pressed against every window, patient, watching. The Fogbound Express moved north, deeper into the dark. A detective doesn't stop being a detective when the badge is gone. The habits are carved too deep. So Harlan did what he'd always done when something didn't add up. He went back to the beginning and counted everything twice. He cataloged it all. The paper, thick, expensive, the kind sold in proper stationery shops. The ink, rust brown, dried but still carrying the faint iron smell of something organic. The handwriting careful, deliberate, learned in an era when penmanship was considered a virtue. Whoever had written this note had been educated long ago, had been patient ever since. But what disturbed him most wasn't the note itself, it was the implication. The mist remembers what you forget. Someone on this train knew something about him, something specific, something he hadn't remembered yet, and that was the kind of threat that didn't need a weapon. The lurch hit like a fist, one moment, then darkness. Not the soft, apologetic darkness of a power cut. This was total, absolute, the kind of dark that makes you wonder if your eyes are open. 3 seconds, 4, 5.
The lamps returned. Harlan was already in the corridor. The door should have been closed. He'd walked this corridor earlier. He remembered the Do Not Disturb card. He remembered the closed door. But memory and evidence are different things, and the evidence now was a door swinging gently open onto a berth that was empty, its bed turned down but never slept in, its lamp burning steadily as though nothing whatsoever had happened here. Except something had. The burn was recent. He could feel the heat radiating from the fabric. Not the warmth of a body or a lamp, but the specific warmth of something that had fired and cooled within the last few minutes. The pattern was wrong for any candle or gas lamp. It curved in on itself. It looked like an exit wound, or an entrance. The blood smear was deliberate in its simplicity, a reaching hand, a sliding motion. Someone had been here, standing at this wall, and then not been here. The mark remained, the person did not. Ada Vane, you see it too. She said it quietly, without drama. Not a question, a confirmation, as though she'd been waiting for someone to stand in this doorway and look at what she'd already found, and had begun to wonder if it would ever happen. Harlan. Ozone. The smell like lightning. Ada. Or something that wants to be. Ada Vane, it turned out, was a retired archivist from the British Library who had spent 11 years cataloging what she called displacement events on British rail lines, disappearances, reported time anomalies, passengers arriving at destinations they hadn't boarded for, passengers who couldn't account for where they'd been. She showed him the journal. 37 recorded incidents on this specific route, dating back to 1893. The earliest account described a full passenger car, 22 people, arriving in Edinburgh carrying passengers who had not boarded in London. No record of where the originals had gone. The replacements had no memory of boarding.
Their eyes, a station guard had written at the time, were distant, as if they were looking at something several feet behind wherever they seemed to be looking. I think this train is the incident, Harlan, not a one-time event, a recurring one. The fog appears on a specific lunar cycle, the train runs, and something uses the transit. Uses the transit. He let those words sit in the space between them. Outside, the fog was pressing closer now against every window, as though the conversation had attracted its attention. They come back wrong. All of them come back wrong. There is a particular kind of fear that professionals feel, the fear that arrives not in a rush, but in increments, each small discovery adding another weight to a scale that was already tipping wrong. Harlan had felt it in murder investigations, the moment when coincidence became pattern, when pattern became intention. That moment had arrived. Ellis, the porter, found them before they found him. He'd been looking for them, which meant he'd been afraid to be alone, which meant the man whose natural state was cheerful efficiency had encountered something that cheerful efficiency couldn't process. The engines lost contact with the network, not just weak signal, nothing, total absence, like the infrastructure out there simply isn't. I've tried 3 communication systems, the emergency band, nothing responds. And the driver? Harlan asked. Ellis didn't answer. He just looked at the floor between them with the expression of a man who'd knocked on a door and found something on the other side that he wished desperately he could unsee. It was Ada who suggested counting the carriages. She'd been on this train before, twice, as part of her research, always disembarking before whatever happened. She knew the floor plan. 7 passenger cars, a dining car, the engine. That was the map. That was what the printed card mounted in every corridor promised. They counted 9. 1 extra car. Between car 7 and what should have been car 8, a car that appeared on no schedule, no manifest, no carriage map.
Its exterior matched the rest of the train perfectly. Same brass fittings, same dark green paneling, same vintage silhouette. But there was no record that it existed. There was no reason for it to be here. And yet, here it was. And the door was unlocked. Inside, the world changed register. Gone was the gaslit warmth of the passenger carriages, replaced by something technical and cold and alive in a way that technology shouldn't be. Instruments covered both walls, dials without labels, readouts in a format none of them recognized, cables that seemed to pulse with a dim light of their own. The air smelled of ozone and something older, mineral, like caves, like deep time. The central unit was warm to the touch. Ada pulled her hand back as though it had spoken to her. The notes were clinical, precise, written by someone who had done this many times and tracked their results with the detached rigor of a scientist who had long since stopped being troubled by what the data meant. Interval, 43 days. Yield, variable. The threshold holds while the mist persists. Do not interfere with selective processing. And below those, indifferent handwriting, shaking, urgent, the handwriting of someone running out of time and knowing it. They come back wrong. All of them come back wrong. Someone has to know. Selective processing. Harlan said the words aloud, and they tasted wrong in his mouth. Clinical language applied to human beings, to passengers, to people who had boarded a train expecting only to arrive somewhere and had instead become, what? Material? Subjects? Yield? Ada. Gerald Fenn had that briefcase. He was counting intervals. He knew how long they had. Harlan. He was trying to warn me. He ran out of time to finish. And then, through the glass, in the absolute white movement, not dramatic, not the sudden lunge of something attacking, just the slow, enormous movement of something very large that had all the time it needed and knew it. Something that had been doing this for a very long time and had never yet been interrupted. Until tonight. Do not interfere with selective processing. There is a moment in every investigation when the evidence stops being theoretical, when it walks toward you down a corridor with its eyes aimed somewhere you cannot see. 3 passengers were moving through the dining car when Harlan and Ada returned from the maintenance car. 3 passengers who Harlan was almost certain had not been visible for the past hour. 3 passengers who should, logically, have been in their berths, and who were now walking through the train with the smooth, purposeful movement of people who had somewhere to be, but had forgotten, at some fundamental level, what having somewhere to be actually meant. Their eyes were the thing. Not glazed, that would have been too simple, too dramatic, a fever or a shock. These eyes were precise, functional. They tracked movement, registered doorways, navigated the narrow corridor without difficulty. But they didn't land on anything. They passed over Harlan and Ada the way eyes pass over furniture, present in the room, not part of the room, not worth the weight of attention. The interesting parts. They're being removed. She'd said it earlier, that the passengers looked edited. Now Harlan understood what she meant. These were the shells of people, the operating systems, stripped of whatever made the software interesting. They were complete, they were functional, they were missing everything that mattered. One of them, a woman Harlan had spoken to briefly at the bar, a school teacher traveling to Edinburgh. Warm and funny, with a habit of laughing at her own jokes before she'd finished telling them, passed within arm's reach. He said her name. She turned. She waited, the way a door waits, with patience and no particular investment in the outcome. Mrs. Calloway, do you know what time it is? How long you've been on the train? I've been on the train. We're going north. The fog is very thick tonight, isn't it? It was all correct. Every fact was accurate. The fog was thick, they were going north, she had been on the train, but delivered in that flat, patient register, with that smile that knew the muscles required for smiling but couldn't find the reason for it. It was one of the loneliest things Harlan had ever heard. He let her continue down the corridor. He watched until she turned the corner and disappeared. Whatever it's taking, it isn't memory. She remembers being on the train. She remembers facts. It's taking something harder to name than that. Curiosity. She had questions earlier about the fog, about the route. She wanted to know things. Now she doesn't want anything. It was taking the part of a person that reached toward things, the part that wondered, the part that needed. Leave that out and the mechanism runs perfectly. Eats, breathes, answers questions, navigates corridors. Everything a body is required to do. But the light behind the eyes, the particular light that makes a face rather than a mask, that light was gone. Ellis found them again in the corridor. He was past professional composure now, his good nature stripped back to something rawer and more honest. He looked at Mrs. Calloway's retreating figure and then at Harlan, and his face asked the question his mouth couldn't quite form. She was different before, wasn't she? I'm not imagining that. You're not imagining it. Is it going to happen to us?
Harlan didn't answer immediately, because the answer depended on a question he hadn't solved yet. What was the difference between the passengers who came back altered and the ones still standing in the corridor having this conversation? What had Gerald Fenn known that had let him survive long enough to leave a note? What was the fog selecting for? He looked at Ada, with her 11 years of research and her multilingual journal and her habit of asking questions that most people were too frightened to finish. He looked at Ellis, scared but present, choosing to stay rather than retreat to a berth and wait for it to be over. He thought about himself, the retired detective who couldn't stop detecting, who'd sat down in a corner of this train and immediately started cataloging the wrong things. Selective processing. The fog presses hardest, he understood, on the ones with nothing left to ask. Every investigation has a moment of clarity. Not comfort, clarity rarely brings comfort, but that moment when the shape of the thing finally resolves, when all the fragments that seemed unconnected reveal the architecture beneath them. Harlan had felt it before, standing in rooms that held the evidence of terrible things, the moment arriving quietly, without announcement. Now you see it. He saw it now. The notes in the maintenance car had been written by two different people. The first, clinical, methodical, tracking intervals and yields, was the author of the system. Whatever this car was, whatever these instruments did, someone had built them, calibrated them, and had been monitoring their performance with the satisfaction of an engineer whose machine runs well. That author was not on this train. That author, Harlan suspected, was not required to be. The second author, shaken hand, urgent, running out of time, had been a passenger, had found this car the way Harlan and Ada had found it, and had understood in the time remaining exactly what was happening. Ada. Gerald Fenn. Look at the handwriting.
Gerald Fenn had been on this train before, not as a passenger, as a researcher. Like Ada, he'd been studying the incidents. Like Ada, he'd come prepared, with his briefcase of documentation and his interval calculations and his obsessive timekeeping. Unlike Ada, he'd encountered the car on a previous journey and had left that note as a warning for whoever came next. And then, on this journey, his time had run out. He'd known it was running out. That was what the watch was measuring. Not the hour, the interval, the window before the threshold closed. 43 days between events. He knew the exact moment it would begin again. He was here to try and stop it, or document it, or both. He didn't get to finish either. Why some of us? Why not all of us? Ellis had asked the right question, the question that unlocked the rest of it, because not all passengers were the same to the fog.
That was the answer the maintenance car gave them, once they knew what they were looking at. The instruments were readers, not weapons. They measured something about each passenger, scanned them in some way Harlan couldn't begin to technically understand, and sorted. The word in the notes was yield, variable yield. Some passengers yielded more than others. Yielded what? The thing that gave eyes their light, the reaching toward, the curiosity, the particular human refusal to accept that a question doesn't have an answer. The fog harvested wonder, and then it returned the remainder, politely, gently, complete in every functional sense, just quieter. He thought about 30 years of walking into rooms after the damage had been done, 30 years of reconstruction, building backward from evidence to event, from consequence to cause. He'd always been good at that. He'd always been better at understanding what happened than at preventing it. Retirement had taught him, in its short months, that this was a deficit he'd never properly reckoned with.
Tonight, he decided, was a different kind of investigation. We don't know what those controls do. We don't know what disabling it would mean for the train, for the passengers who've already been processed, for... I know, but I know what leaving it running means. I know what they'll be when we arrive. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened her journal to the section she'd been writing on this journey. Fresh ink, tight script, the accumulation of the night's evidence, and she wrote something at the bottom of the last page. She showed it to Ellis. She showed it to Harlan. If this is the last entry, the mechanism is real. The selection is intentional. The fog is not a weather event. Someone built this. Someone is still running it. Someone has to stop it. The Fogbound Express moved through absolute white silence. Outside, the fog pressed and breathed and waited with the patience of something that had been doing this for over a century and had never yet been meaningfully interrupted. The central unit glowed. The needles held their positions. The system continued its careful work. Harlan Voss put his hand on the panel. A retired detective is still a detective. The habits don't uninstall when you hand in the warrant card. And the most fundamental habit of all, the one that had driven 30 years of walking into difficult rooms and refusing to leave until he understood what happened, was this: you don't walk away while the crime is still being committed. The fog pressed against every window of the Fogbound Express, white and vast and ancient beyond reckoning, and for the first time in over 100 years, something pressed back. The mist remembers what you forget, but memory, real memory, human memory, is not a passive thing. It reaches back, it argues, it refuses to be filed away and processed and yielded to something with needles and dials and a 43-day cycle. It fights.